Hello and welcome back to another video on my channel. I just realized my channel doesn't have a name and I think we should fix that. Comment below if you have a good name for my channel. Anyway, as usual, we are going to get started with a wildlife wild fact. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking hammerhead sharks. Hammerhead sharks are some of, in my opinion, the coolest, most prehistoric looking sharks there are. There are 9 species of hammerhead sharks, and the great hammerhead shark is the largest of those species, and they can grow an average of 13 feet and weigh around 500 pounds. That is a very, very large shark. I hope you think hammerhead sharks are as cool as I do. Anyway, on to the problem at hand. So today we are doing LEETCODE problem number 200 on the dot, called Number of Islands. Number of islands is a problem that I have heard from so many different people as a problem that's come up on their technical interviews. So we are absolutely going to go over this problem, and I hope that you get out of it as much as I did by practicing it. Alright, so the problem says, given an m by n 2D binary grid, which represents a map of 1s, which are lands, and 0s, which are water, return the number of islands. An island is surrounded by water and is formed by connecting adjacent lands horizontally or vertically. You may assume all 4 edges of the grid are surrounded by water. So if we have a 1 on any of the edges of our grid, we can assume that the outside edges of those grids are also water as well. So if we look at the first example that they give us, you can see that we have all of these 1s here, and on one of the 4 sides, vertically or horizontally, up, left, down, or right, some of these 1s are touching another 1. And there is only one given island here. If we look at example 2, however, you have this first island in the first 4 spots, this first box in the upper left-hand corner, and then it is touching another land, but that is not vertically or horizontally touching it, only diagonally, so it's not considered part of the same island. So that next bit of land is actually an island on its own. And then diagonally from that, we have in the bottom right 2 boxes, another island. So that totals 3 islands. So, how are we going to start this problem? Well, the way I want to do it is by going over every box that is a land. And when I hit a land, I want to touch every adjacent box to that land. I want to go up, I want to go down, I want to go to the right, and I want to go to the left. And from there, we want to check if any of those boxes are also 1s. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something that I'm going to call flooding it. If I see a 1 attached to another 1, I am going to turn it into a 0, which means it's going to turn into water, thereby flooding it. So when we hit another 1 going through our grid, that means we are actually going to be touching another island. If it doesn't make sense now, hopefully it will once we write some code. So the first thing I'm going to do is initialize our count, which of course has to start at 0. The other thing I'm going to create here is a variable, and I'm going to call it our compass. And if you think of our compass, a compass has 4 cardinal directions. It has north, south, east, and west. Now, for our purposes, our compass is going to have up, down, left, and right. And what is going to represent those directions are arrays of two elements that are either going to be -1, 0, or 1, which will tell us which direction to move from our current coordinate. So the first one is going to be a -1 and a 0, then a 0 and a -1. So this in turn will go up, and this will go left. Next, we have a 1 and a 0, which will go down 1, and we have 0, 1, which will move to the right 1 box. You'll see how that fits in a little bit later. Now, we have to simply loop over our grid, and as we go over the grid, I want to check if any of the boxes we hit are 1s. Or in other words, I want to check if any of the boxes we hit are lands. So if grid at I at j equals 1, well, what do we want to do? We want to, of course, increment our count, because that tells us we've hit an island, and we also want to start this function that we're going to create in which we visit all of the surrounding boxes to check if they are also land or if they are water. I'm going to call that flood, because we are in essence going to use this function to flood all of our surrounding bits of island. And what I'm going to pass into it are my current coordinates of I and j. Now what we have to do is create that flood function. So I'm going to call it flood, like I said, and it's going to take in two parameters. It's going to take in a row, and it's going to take in a column. From here, we have to do a check. We have to make sure that neither the row nor the column are outside of the current grid. So we have to make sure that neither are less than 0, and we have to make sure that the row is not equal to or greater than the grid's length, and we have to make sure that the column is not equal to or greater than any given row's length either. So we'll write out that if statement, and we also want to check if the current element is a 0 or a 1. Really, we just want to know if it's a 0. If it's a 0 or any of these other conditions, we can break out of this current iteration of this function, because we know that we don't have to change anything to water. We've already hit water, or we've hit the edge of the grid, which actually is water. And if we hit any of these conditions, like I said, we just want to break out of this iteration of this function by returning out of it. We don't need to return anything. We're not storing these values anywhere. The next thing that we want to do, and this is the most important part, is if we make it past any of those conditions, that means we are on another land. And if we are on another land, we want to flood it by turning it into a 0, changing it to water. That way, if we come across it again, we will note that it is water, and we can just continue on from there. And finally, this is the real crux of this function right here, is we want to use our compass directions from before in order to visit all of the adjacent boxes to the box that we are currently on. So I'm just going to make a for loop here, and I'm going to say for const, we'll call it dir for direction of our compass. I want to send these coordinates back into this function. So in order to do that, I'm going to add each direction of the compass onto my current coordinates and pass those as arguments back into my flood function. So we have to say row, which is the current row that we are on, plus the direction at index 0, because that will be our x coordinate. And then we also want to do our column plus direction at index 1, which will be our y coordinate there. So we are passing in each of these as arguments back into our flood function. And of course, the last thing that we have to do is to return our initial count. We run the code, and we can also submit the code as usual, and you'll see that we got our correct solution. Now that we've got our correct solution, I want to do a sort of pseudo walkthrough of this problem with you, just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to grab my second input that they give us. So the first thing that we do is we go through this grid until we find a 1. So as you can see, the very first element is this 1. So we are going to right away increment our count to 1. We have officially found our first island. And then what we do is we send the coordinates of this land that we just found back into our flood function. And in this flood function, we check if the coordinates are anywhere outside of the grid. That's what these first 4 conditions do. And we check if it's a 0. Right now, we know that we're on the very first index of this grid at index 0, 0. So we know that we are within the confines of the grid, and we know that it is not a 0. So we don't hit this condition, and we go on to the next line. So what we do from here is we turn this bit of land into a 0. And what we do next is we take all of the directions from our compass array. I'll move them down here. And as you can see, we are going to add each of these numbers onto our current coordinates. So for instance, we are at index 0, 0. The next index that we are going to pass into this flood function is index -1, 0, because 0 plus -1 is -1, and 0 plus 0 is 0. And then when we go back through that, we'll actually hit this condition because our row will be less than 0, and we will be outside the confines of the grid, and we will return out of the function and move on to the next direction, which is our row 0 plus column -1, which will also actually put us to the left of our current grid. So we will break out of this function again, and we move on to the next one, and this time we move up 1, and we stay in the same column, the same y coordinate. And since it doesn't hit any of these, we then change it to a 0, and we go and we do all of the surrounding elements in this grid for that particular piece of land. But we also are still going through the unfinished iteration of our first element, and we have to go to the right of that as well, which would put us here, and we would turn this into a 0. And then eventually, once we go through this whole thing again for this one, we go to the element to the right, and we turn that into a 0. So now you can see we've actually flooded that entire island. Since we flooded that entire island, when we continue over our double for loop on lines 9 and 10, we're not going to hit any more 1s, until we then get to this one right here on line 23. And once we do that, we do the same flood function again, and that becomes a 0. And again, we end up breaking out of our flood function and going through our double loop until we get to this final island down here, and we run the flood function back one final time. By the way, I should have incremented count for the second island that we found. And again, for now, this final island, which is island number 3, and we flood this island as well. And after we flood this island, that's it. We've hit the end of our double for loop because we've hit the end of the grid. Count has been now incremented to 3, so we can return that we have found 3 different islands. I hope that this walkthrough of the number of islands problem was helpful to you. I had to go over this problem multiple times. There's ways to do this with breadth first search, depth first search. There's multiple ways to do it with depth first search. I urge you to try to do this problem in as many different ways as possible. It will only help you to understand it better in the future. Please, in the comments below, let me know if there are any other LeetCode problems you would like me to solve. Let me know if you liked the wildlife wild fact, or if there's any other animals you would like me to put in next week's or any other week's wildlife wild fact. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, thank you so much for watching. I do hope to see you in the next video. Have a great week.